A lot of professionals reach a point in their job search where one question starts to loom larger than it should. How do I explain a career gap without hurting my chances? Not because career gaps are unusual, but because most people were never taught how to talk about them in a way that feels confident, credible, and controlled. So what happens instead? People start second-guessing themselves. They rehearse long explanations in their head. They worry that the gap says something negative about their ability, their reliability, or their value before they've even had a chance to talk about what they actually bring to the role. Here's what I want you to hear clearly from the start. Career gaps happen, and they happen to highly capable, high-performing professionals. Some gaps are intentional, some are forced, and many are simply the result of how unpredictable today's job market has become. The gap itself is rarely the issue. The way it's explained is what determines how it's received. In this video, I'm going to show you how to explain career gaps without hurting your chances with confidence, honesty, and restraint. By the end, you will know what hiring managers are actually listening for when a gap comes up, why over-explaining often works against you, and how to deliver a clear 30 to 60-second explanation, and how to pivot the conversation back to your value, relevance, and leadership. Before we go any further, if you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the bell so that you're notified every time we post a new video. On this channel, we talk about search strategy, but also encouragement, perspective, and practical guidance for navigating career transitions with clarity and confidence. So whether you're actively interviewing, regrouping after a setback, or simply looking for direction in this season of your career, you're in the right place, and I'm glad you're here. From the hiring side of the table, career gaps rarely trigger the kind of alarm candidates imagine. What does stand out is how people respond when the gap comes up. As a former executive recruiter, I've reviewed thousands of resumes and sat in countless interview debriefs. And when career gaps appeared, the conversation was almost never, why did this person step away? It was usually something much simpler. Does their experience still line up with what we need right now? Can they explain their path clearly? Do they sound confident in how they're positioned? That distinction matters because the emotional weight candidates carry into the conversation often doesn't exist on the hiring side until it's introduced through hesitation, over-explaining, or defensiveness. And I understand why that happens. When a gap wasn't planned, when it came after a layoff, when it stretched longer than expected, it's easy to assume it needs to be justified. But from a recruiter's perspective, gaps are contextual, not disqualifying. If we haven't met yet, my name is Chuks Agada. Most people know me as Dr. A. I'm an executive career coach and former executive recruiter. I work with experienced professionals navigating senior level interviews, leadership transitions, and nonlinear career paths where how you tell your story matters. Through my work at Career Calibration, I've helped directors, VPs, executives, those in the C-suite move through hiring processes with clarity, even when their career timelines didn't look perfect on paper. And here's what I want you to take into the rest of this video. Hiring managers aren't looking for perfection, they're listening for coherence. So next, I want to walk you through what recruiters and hiring managers are actually evaluating when a career gap comes up and how to explain yours in a way that keeps trust intact and focus on your value. Let's get right into it. Here's the first thing to understand. Career gaps don't create problems in interviews. The way candidates emotionally manage career gaps does. From the hiring side, a gap on a resume is simply a data point. It's a period of time that prompts a clarifying question, not a conclusion. Recruiters and hiring managers are trained to look for patterns, consistency, and role alignment over time. A gap doesn't automatically disrupt any of that. What disrupts is how the explanation unfolds once the topic is raised. When professionals feel uneasy about a gap, that discomfort tends to show up in very predictable ways. They start talking faster, they provide unnecessary backstory, they justify decisions that don't actually require justification. They try to get ahead of assumptions that haven't even been made yet. And in doing so, they unintentionally change the tone of the interview. Instead of conversation about fit and capability, it starts to feel like a defense. From a recruiter's perspective, that shift is noticeable, not because the gap is concerning, but because uncertainty has entered the room. Hiring decisions are at their core about risk management. When a candidate appears unsure about their own story, it raises a subtle question. If they're not confident in how they frame this chapter, what else might feel unresolved? This is where well-intentioned candidates end up creating friction they were trying to avoid. And it gets worse when people attempt to hide the gap entirely, altering dates, compressing timelines, leaving roles off resumes without a coherent explanation. According to HireRight's employment study, found that nearly 2 in 5 employers reported at least one discrepancy per 20 candidates screened. And employment verifications, including job dates and titles, were among the most commonly detected discrepancy during background checks. And these discrepancies often stem from attempts to smooth over gaps rather than the gaps themselves. In other words, the gap isn't what damages trust. The attempt to disguise it does. There's also a psychological layer here that's worth naming. Many high-performing professionals are used to being evaluated on results and upward momentum. When that momentum pauses, whether due to layoffs, caregiving, help, or market conditions, it can feel personal, even when it isn't. That internal judgment doesn't stay internal. It shows up in posture, tone, word choice, and hiring managers are remarkably sensitive to those signals. The irony is this: when a career gap is explained calmly, briefly, and without emotional charge, it often lands as neutral or even responsible. When it's explained defensively or at length, it becomes something the interviewer feels compelled to examine more closely. And that's where unnecessary risk is introduced. When a gap comes up in an interview, most candidates assume the question is about the gap itself. It rarely is. From a recruiter or hiring manager's perspective, the gap is simply a signal to check for continuity, not perfection. What they're really evaluating falls into 3 broad areas: relevance, readiness, and risk. So let's break those down. First, relevance. Hiring managers want to know whether your experience still maps cleanly to the role in front of them. A gap doesn't automatically disrupt that. What disrupts it is silence or ambiguity around how your skills connect now. If the interviewer can still see a straight line from your background to the current role, the gap fades quickly into the background. Second, readiness. This is where many candidates misinterpret the concern. Readiness is not about whether you're working every single month. It's about whether your skills, judgment, and perspective are still sharp and applicable. According to a study by Compumel, employers care far more about demonstrated capability and recent relevance than uninterrupted timelines, especially for experienced professionals. At senior levels, hiring cycles are longer, and career paths are increasingly nonlinear. A gap only becomes an issue when it leaves the interviewer wondering, are they still operating at the level we need? That question is answered through how you speak about your work, not through dates on a resume. Third, risk. This is the part candidates tend to personalize, but it's important to depersonalize it. Hiring is a risk management exercise. Managers aren't asking what went wrong in this person's life. They're asking what the likelihood that this person will succeed here. And here's where things often go sideways. When candidates over-explain a gap, hesitate, or sound uncertain, it introduces perceived risk that wasn't there before. Not because of the gap, but because the explanation feels unresolved. From the hiring side, clarity is calming. A concise explanation signals self-awareness, emotional steadiness, and confidence in your own trajectory. That's why the strongest explanations don't dwell on what happened. They quickly establish that the gap has context, that it's not ongoing or destabilizing, and that you are fully prepared for what's next once the boxes are checked. Attention naturally returns to your value. This is also why trying to preempt concerns often backfires when you answer questions that haven't been asked yet. You can accidentally surface doubts that weren't even on the interviewer's radar. A calm, contained explanation does the opposite. It reassures the interviewer that nothing about your career path requires special handling. And in hiring conversations, that sense of normalcy is incredibly powerful. Once you understand what hiring managers are actually evaluating, the next challenge becomes execution. because knowing what they care about doesn't automatically translate into how to explain your situation clearly and confidently. From the hiring side, the strongest career gap explanations share one defining characteristic. They are structured, not scripted, not emotional, not overly polished, structured. That structure matters because it creates clarity, and clarity lowers perceived risk. Without a structure, candidates tend to drift. They start in one place, loop back to earlier details, and add context that wasn't needed. The explanation stretches longer than it should, and the interviewer starts paying attention to the gap instead of the fit. That's why the ideal explanation lives in the 30 to 60 second range, not because hiring managers are impatient, but because brevity signals resolution. It communicates that this chapter is understood, contained, and not central to your professional identity. At its core, a strong explanation does three things in this order. First, name the gap simply. This is factual statement, not framing, no justification. Second, establish stability. You make it clear that the situation is resolved, managed, or no longer relevant to your ability to perform in the role. And then third, pivot forward. You reconnect the conversation to your skills, value, and relevance to the role in front of you. Let me show you what this actually sounds like. So here's an example. Maybe of someone who's laid off or prolonged job search. I was impacted by a company-wide layoff, and shortly after that, hiring slowed down significantly across my function. I used that time to stay current and be selective about my next move, which is why this role stood out. Notice the structure. The gap is named without emotion. Market conditions are acknowledged, not blamed. The pivot brings the focus back to alignment. So here's a second example. This is someone who was maybe a caregiver or had family responsibilities. I stepped away from the workforce for a period to support a family member, and that situation is now stable. I'm fully available and very focused on returning to a role where I can contribute at a high level. Notice, no personal detail, no oversharing, just clarity and readiness. And here's the third example, someone who was probably burned out or they had an intentional reset. After several intense years in my last role, I made a deliberate decision to step back and reassess what I wanted my next chapter to look like. That clarity is what led me to this opportunity. So notice here, the gap is framed as intentional, not reactive, and the pivot reinforces purpose. And here's a fourth example. So this could be like a health-related gap. You don't have to disclose what the actual health scare or health issue was. I took some time away to address a personal matter, which is now resolved. I'm fully able to perform in this role and excited about applying my experience here. So notice here that this establishes stability without inviting follow-up questions, which is exactly the goal. And then I want to give you a final example. This could possibly be someone who may have had multiple short gaps or market volatility. Over the past couple of years, my industry experienced several restructurings, which created some short transitions between roles. Throughout that time, I stayed focused on roles where my skills would be used effectively, including this one. So notice here that this normalizes volatility and signals resilience. What's important to notice across all of these examples is what's not happening. There's no apologizing, there's no emotional justification, there's no attempt to preempt unasked questions, unasked concerns, and that's intentional. Interviews are not therapy sessions. They are decision-making environments. When you explain a career gap, calmly, briefly, and without emotional charge, it communicates something far more important than continuity. It communicates self-trust. And from a recruiter or hiring manager's perspective, that composure often carries more weight than an uninterrupted timeline. Now, if any of this is resonating with you, do me a favor and tap that like button. It really helps this video reach out to other professionals who need this perspective. And quick question for you. When you think about explaining your career story, what part feels hardest to talk about? The gap itself, how long it lasted, or how you think it might be perceived? Drop your answer in the comments. You're not the only one navigating this, even if it feels that way. Once candidates understand how to explain a career gap clearly and confidently, the biggest risk is not the gap itself. It's accidentally undermining trust during the explanation. From the hiring side, there are a handful of patterns that consistently create unnecessary concern. And what's important to understand is that none of these mistakes are malicious. They're almost always driven by anxiety. But anxiety has a way of changing how things land. One of the most common mistakes is over-explaining. When a candidate feels insecure about a gap, they often try to provide every detail to make it make sense. The explanation stretches from seconds into minutes, and instead of reassuring the interviewer, it invites deeper scrutiny. From a recruiter's perspective, length signals uncertainty. If something requires extensive justification, it starts to feel unresolved, even when it isn't. Another mistake is apologizing. Phrases like, "I know this probably looks bad. I wish it hadn't happened. I'm hoping this doesn't count against me." These statements shift the frame of the conversation. Instead of presenting your career as a series of experiences, you're asking for forgiveness, and that subtly lowers your perceived confidence in authority. And third mistake is preemptively answering questions that weren't asked. Candidates sometimes try to anticipate every possible concern and address them all at once. Ironically, this can introduce doubt that wasn't there to begin with. Hiring managers don't need every answer up front. They need clarity, and clarity is created through relevance, not value. Another trust-eroding behavior is inconsistency. This shows up when resume dates don't align with LinkedIn, explanations change slightly from conversation to conversation, details feel vague or overly polished, and according to HireRight background screening data, inconsistencies across resumes, applications, and interviews are one of the most common reasons candidates face delays or additional scrutiny during the hiring process. Again, it's not the gap, it's the mismatch. Finally, there's emotional leakage. This is when frustration, resentment, or self-doubt shows up in tone, even when the words themselves are fine. Hiring managers are highly attuned to this, especially at senior levels, not because they lack empathy, but because they're assessing composure under pressure. If a candidate sounds unsettled by their own story, it raises a subtle question. Will this show up again when things get difficult in the role? That's not a fair conclusion, but hiring decisions are rarely made on logic alone. The good news is this: all of these mistakes are preventable, and avoiding them doesn't require perfection or performance. It requires intention. When you keep your explanation brief, consistent, and forward-focused, the gap stops being the story and becomes just one small part of it. That's where trust is preserved. And once that is intact, hiring conversations move forward naturally. The most important part of explaining a career gap isn't the explanation itself. It's what happens immediately after. That's where you either lose control of the conversation or regain it. From the hiring side, once a gap has been acknowledged and placed in context, attention naturally shifts. The interviewer isn't trying to stay in the past, they're listening for signals about the present. Can this person contribute? Do their skills still apply? Do they understand what this role actually requires? This is why every career gap explanation should end with a deliberate pivot back to value: your skills, your relevance, your impact. Without that pivot, the explanation can feel unfinished. Interviewer may linger on the gap longer than necessary, not because it's concerning, but because you didn't give them a clear place to redirect their focus. With the pivot, something important changes. You take control of the narrative. The gap becomes background information instead of the headline. The conversation moves forward, which is exactly where hiring decisions are made. For example, a good pivot narrative is, what I'm excited about now is bringing that experience into a role where I could immediately contribute in X, Y, and Z ways. That sentence isn't a filler. It signals readiness, it reinforces alignment, and it recenters the discussion on outcomes. From a recruiter or a hiring manager's perspective, this is the moment where engagement returns. Hiring managers don't want to interrogate gaps. They want to understand how you perform. When you pivot with confidence, you give them permission to move on. This is especially critical for experienced professionals. At senior levels, hiring decisions are less about perfect timelines and more about judgment, clarity, and execution. Leaders are hired for what they can solve, not for whether their path was interrupted. The pivot communicates that you understand this. It tells the interviewer, this chapter has context, but it doesn't define me. And perhaps, most importantly, it demonstrates self-trust. When you explain a career gap briefly and then redirect without hesitation, you show that you're comfortable with your story. You're not asking to be evaluated on absence. You're inviting evaluation based on value. That's how you regain control. And that's how hiring conversations move forward. If you're currently navigating a career transition, we'd love to see if we can help. Check out our website at careercalibration.co. I'll provide a link in the description below. I look forward to meeting you there. Also, would you like expert job search advice delivered weekly in your inbox? Sign up to join our exclusive email list. Get exclusive insights designed to help you land your next role. Sign up today by clicking on the link below and take control of your job search. And finally, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment below. See you next time. Over and out.